In the early hours of August 9, 1945, while the city of Nagasaki was still hours away from its own annihilation, something else was already happening along a front that stretched for nearly 5,000 miles across the frozen grasslands and mountain passes of Manchuria. It was happening quietly by the standards of what was about to unfold. No single flash of light, no mushroom cloud visible from the stratosphere, just a grinding rumble of tank engines and the creak of artillery pieces being unlimbered in the darkness. And then, all at once, the eruption of the largest coordinated military offensive the Soviet Union had ever launched against a single enemy. 1.5 million men, 5,000 tanks, over 5,000 aircraft, 26,000 artillery pieces pointed at the borders of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. The operation had a name. The Soviets called it Operation August Storm. And within 72 hours, it would do something that 2 atomic bombs, 3 years of island-hopping warfare, and the firebombing of 67 Japanese cities had not yet fully accomplished. It would break the will of the Japanese Imperial Army's high command to continue fighting. Not because of what it destroyed, because of what it revealed, because of what it proved in the coldest and most irrefutable terms possible about the nature of the trap Japan had built for itself and could no longer escape. To understand why August Storm mattered the way it did, you have to understand what Japan was actually planning in the summer of 1945. This is the part of the story that most Western accounts of the Pacific War skip over, because it is uncomfortable, because it complicates the clean narrative in which 2 atomic bombs ended the war, and that was that. The reality is considerably more disturbing. By the summer of 1945, Japan's military leadership had developed and was actively preparing to execute a defensive strategy called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. The premise of Ketsugo was this: the Americans were going to invade the Japanese home islands. Everyone in Tokyo knew it was coming. The question, in the minds of the Imperial Army's planners, was not whether Japan could defeat the invasion. They knew they could not defeat it in any conventional military sense. The question was whether Japan could make the invasion so costly, so bloody, so catastrophically expensive in American lives, that the United States government would eventually decide that a negotiated peace was preferable to the continued slaughter of its own soldiers. This was not a fantasy plan. It was a coldly rational calculation built on real numbers and real capabilities. Japan had, by August of 1945, assembled on the home islands approximately 2.5 million regular army troops. In addition to these professional soldiers, the Japanese government had mobilized somewhere between 28 and 32 million civilian militia members, men and women, and in some cases teenagers, armed with bamboo spears and ancient firearms, and given basic training in how to die fighting. The beaches of Kyushu, where American planners intended to land the first invasion wave in November 1945, had been fortified to a depth that made the defenses at Normandy look preliminary by comparison. Thousands of Oka rocket-powered kamikaze aircraft had been built and concealed in caves and tunnels across the island. Thousands of Shinyo explosive motorboats were waiting in hidden coastal installations. Conventional kamikaze aircraft numbered in the thousands. Submarines modified for suicide attacks. Human torpedoes. Divers trained to swim beneath landing craft and detonate explosive charges strapped to their bodies. American planners knew about much of this. They had broken Japanese communications codes years earlier. They had aerial reconnaissance. They had intelligence from prisoners and captured documents. What they saw frightened them badly. The planning estimates for Operation Downfall, the American invasion of Japan, projected American casualties ranging from 250,000 to over 1 million men killed and wounded, depending on how deeply the invasion progressed and how effectively Japanese resistance could be organized. Some estimates went higher. The same calculations projected Japanese military and civilian deaths in the tens of millions. The firebombing campaign that General Curtis LeMay had been running since March of 1945, which had already killed more Japanese civilians than either atomic bomb would, was in part an attempt to degrade Japan's defensive preparations before the invasion arrived. It was not working fast enough. Japan's military leadership, watching the bombers come night after night, watching city after city turn to ash, remained committed to Ketsugo, because they believed, with the absolute certainty of men who had never seriously entertained the possibility of unconditional surrender, that the Americans would eventually blink, that the cost of invasion would be high enough to force a negotiated settlement that preserved at least the shell of the imperial system, that kept the emperor on his throne, that allowed Japan to avoid the total humiliation of occupation and dismantlement. This was the strategic situation on August 6, 1945, when the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion killed somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying in the weeks and months that followed from radiation sickness and burn injuries. It was an act of destruction on a scale that had no precedent in the history of warfare. And the Japanese High Command's response in the hours and days that followed is one of the most revealing episodes in the entire history of the Second World War. They did not surrender. The Army leadership, specifically War Minister Korichika Anami and the chiefs of the Army and Navy general staffs, argued that the bomb might be a one-time weapon, that the Americans might not have more of them, that even if they did, the home island defenses could absorb additional atomic attacks and still make an invasion prohibitively costly. They argued that Japan should wait, should continue preparing, should hold firm to the belief that Ketsugo could still deliver a negotiated peace. These were not stupid men. They were not delusional in the clinical sense. They were men who had built their entire identity, their entire institutional existence, around the concept of death before surrender, and they could not process the reality that their position had become militarily and strategically untenable in any framework that required them to actually stop fighting. 3 days after Hiroshima, on the morning of August 9, two things happened within hours of each other that together finally shattered this position beyond any possibility of repair. The first was the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki at 11:02 in the morning, which killed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people, and confirmed that the Americans did indeed have more than one of these weapons and were willing to use them in rapid succession. The second was the Soviet declaration of war and the immediate launch of Operation August Storm, which began just after midnight on the 9th and was already rolling across the Manchurian border by the time the Nagasaki bomb detonated. And it is this second event, the one that receives perhaps 1/10 of the historical attention that the atomic bombs receive in Western accounts of the war's end, that the Japanese military leadership found more immediately and viscerally catastrophic. Not because the Soviet attack was more destructive than the bombs, it was not, but because of what it destroyed that the bombs could not destroy. It destroyed the last remaining strategic option that Japan's military leadership had been holding in reserve. It destroyed the plan. The plan, the secret hope that the army had been carefully nurturing for months, even as the bombs fell and the cities burned, was the Soviet Union. Japan and the Soviet Union had maintained a neutrality pact since April of 1941, a mutual non-aggression agreement that had allowed Japan to focus its military resources on the Pacific and Southeast Asia without worrying about its northern flank, and had allowed the Soviets to focus on surviving the German onslaught without opening a second front in the East. By 1945, the Neutrality Pact was technically still in force. Though the Soviets had already privately informed the Americans at the Yalta Conference in February that they intended to enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat. Germany surrendered on May 8. The clock was running, but the Japanese Foreign Ministry, specifically Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo and the small faction of civilian leaders who were genuinely trying to find a way to end the war, had spent the summer of 1945 desperately attempting to use the Soviet Union as a diplomatic intermediary. The idea was to approach the Soviets, acknowledge that Japan's military position was deteriorating, and ask them to convey to the Western Allies Japan's willingness to negotiate a peace that preserved certain conditions. The Emperor, the imperial system, no war crimes trials, no occupation, or at least a limited and temporary one. The Japanese Foreign Ministry was sending cables to its ambassador in Moscow, Naotate Sato, almost daily through July and into August, instructing him to arrange meetings with Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to press for Soviet mediation to keep the channel open. Ambassador Sato, reading the situation in Moscow with considerably more clarity than Tokyo was demonstrating, sent back cables that were almost painful in their bluntness. He told Tokyo repeatedly that the Soviets had no interest in mediating anything, that the diplomatic initiative was going nowhere, that Japan needed to face reality and make concrete surrender proposals directly to the Americans. Tokyo's leadership, dominated by the army faction, ignored him, because the alternative to the Soviet mediation plan was unconditional surrender. And unconditional surrender was, in their framework, equivalent to national death. So they kept waiting for a Soviet response that was never going to come in the form they needed. And while they waited, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers were quietly moving into position along the Manchurian border. The Kwantung Army, Japan's force in Manchuria, had once been the most powerful and prestigious command in the entire imperial military. In the late 30s, it had fought the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol, and after a catastrophic defeat at the hands of a young Soviet general named Georgy Zhukov, had retreated into a wary coexistence behind the Neutrality Pact. In the years since, the Kwantung Army had been systematically stripped of its best units and equipment. As the Pacific War turned against Japan, division after division had been transferred south to defend the Philippines, to reinforce the Marianas, to die on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By the summer of 1945, the Kwantung Army existed largely on paper. Its nominal strength of around 700,000 men concealed a grim reality. Many of these were recently conscripted Manchurian colonists with minimal training. The veteran divisions that had once made the Kwantung Army feared were gone. The armor that remained was outdated, thin-skinned, and drastically outnumbered. The artillery was insufficient. The logistics were a wreck. Fuel was critically short. The commanders in Manchuria knew their situation. They had been sending increasingly desperate assessments to Tokyo for months, warning that the force they had was nowhere near adequate to defend against a serious Soviet offensive. Tokyo had acknowledged these assessments and done almost nothing, because the resources to do something simply did not exist, and because the diplomatic gamble on Soviet neutrality had made proper preparation for a Soviet attack feel, in some quarters, like an admission of defeat before the fight began. When the Soviet offensive began in the early hours of August 9, the results were immediate and overwhelming. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who commanded the overall operation, had designed August Storm as a three-pronged assault of breathtaking ambition. The Transbaikal Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky would drive southeast across the Gobi Desert and the greater Khingan mountain range, terrain that the Japanese had largely written off as impassable for a major armored offensive. Exactly because of this assumption, to strike at the heart of Manchuria from the west, the First Far Eastern Front under Marshal Kirill Meretskov would attack from the east through the fortified border zones, accepting heavy initial casualties to pin and fix Japanese forces while the western drive cut off their line of retreat. The second Far Eastern Front would push south across the Amur River in the north, adding pressure from a third direction simultaneously. The plan was encirclement on a continental scale, the same deep battle doctrine the Soviets had spent 4 years perfecting against the Wehrmacht, now applied to an enemy that had none of the Wehrmacht's resilience. The Transbaikal Front's advance across the Greater Khingan Mountains was by any measure one of the most audacious armored movements of the entire war. The mountains rose to over 1,000 meters, with narrow passes and steep descents that military engineers had assessed as essentially tank-proof. Soviet tank commanders, drawing on years of operational experience that had no parallel anywhere in the world, found ways through anyway. They drove through passes that Japanese maps marked as impassable. They descended slopes that conventional wisdom said would destroy armored vehicles. They did it fast, faster than anyone had anticipated, faster than the Kwantung Army's command structure could process and respond to. Within 48 hours of the offensive's launch, Soviet armor was already deep into the Manchurian plain, past the defensive zones, cutting off communications and supply lines that the Japanese command depended on. The Kwantung Army's defensive plan, such as it was, assumed that the terrain would slow any Soviet advance long enough for reserves to be positioned and counterattacks organized. The terrain did not slow it. There were no effective reserves to position. The counterattacks that were ordered either never materialized or were swept aside. The fortified border zones in the east, which the Japanese had spent years constructing and which represented the most serious prepared defenses in Manchuria, fell with a speed that shocked even Soviet commanders who had stormed German fortifications at Königsberg and Berlin. The concrete bunkers and underground tunnel complexes had been built to absorb punishment and channel attackers into kill zones. They were manned by troops who, in many cases, fought with genuine ferocity even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. But they were isolated. They could not communicate with a command structure that was itself in chaos. They could not be reinforced because the roads and rail lines bringing reinforcements were already cut or under Soviet air attack. They could not retreat because Soviet armor was already behind them. Some garrisons fought to the last man. Others, finding themselves encircled and without orders and without any rational prospect of relief, surrendered in groups that grew larger by the hour. The fortress complexes that Japanese engineers had spent years turning into supposedly impregnable strongpoints were neutralized within days, not the weeks or months that their designers had intended. In Tokyo, the news from Manchuria arrived in fragments, each one worse than the last. The communications network in Manchuria was already disrupted within the first 24 hours, which meant that the Imperial General Staff was trying to understand a rapidly collapsing situation through reports that were hours old by the time they arrived, from commanders who were themselves struggling to understand what was happening to them. What became clear with gathering and terrible speed was that the strategic reserve that Japan's military planners had quietly counted on, the idea that even if the Americans invaded, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria represented a massive force in being that complicated any simple American victory, was gone, not degraded, not weakened. Gone, encircled, fragmented, cut off, folding in on itself with a speed that no one in Tokyo had believed possible. The army that was supposed to be Japan's insurance policy against total defeat had ceased to function as a coherent military force within 72 hours of the Soviet attack. This is the moment that requires the most careful attention, because it is the moment that most histories of the war's end treat as secondary or background context. And it should not be treated that way. Japan's military leadership in the weeks before August 9 had been holding on to Ketsugo with a kind of desperate mathematical faith. The plan depended on a specific set of assumptions: that the Americans would invade the home islands, that the home island defenses would inflict catastrophic casualties, that the American public would eventually lose the will to absorb those casualties and demand a negotiated settlement. These assumptions were all still theoretically operative after Hiroshima. Even after Nagasaki, the atomic bombs were devastating, but Japan's military leadership could and did construct arguments for why Ketsu-go remained viable even in the face of atomic attack. The bombs had to be delivered by aircraft. Aircraft could be shot down. The kamikaze could attack the carriers and airfields that the bombers depended on. The home island air defenses, though battered, still existed. The civilian militia, regardless of what the bombs did to morale, still numbered in the tens of millions. The Army's internal logic, however deformed by ideology and institutional self-preservation it had become, could still construct a narrative in which Ketsu-go was worth attempting. The Soviet offensive destroyed that narrative completely. Not because it killed more people than the bombs, not because it was more technologically shocking, but because of what it did to Japan's strategic geography. Manchuria was not a peripheral concern. It was the industrial heartland that had fed the Japanese war machine for over a decade. The steel, the coal, the heavy manufacturing, the agricultural surplus that kept the home islands functioning, all of it had flowed from Manchuria. Beyond that, the Kwantung Army had represented, in the minds of Japan's military planners, the last substantial reserve of conventional military power that Japan possessed. If the home island invasion went badly wrong, if the Americans somehow broke through the beach defenses and Ketsu-go failed to deliver the casualties that were supposed to force a negotiated settlement, the Kwantung Army in Manchuria was the fallback, the force that could potentially be brought back to defend the home islands, or at minimum complicate the American strategic picture. Now that fallback was gone, and the Soviets were advancing not just in Manchuria but in Korea and in southern Sakhalin, moving toward positions from which they could potentially participate in an invasion of the home islands themselves. An American invasion was a nightmare that Ketsu-go was designed to manage. A combined American and Soviet invasion of the Japanese home islands was an apocalypse that no plan could manage, that no defensive scheme could survive. That led to no outcome the military leadership could describe as anything other than total annihilation. Emperor Hirohito had been monitoring the situation with increasing alarm throughout the summer of 1945. His role in Japan's decision-making process is one of the most debated questions in the historiography of the Pacific War, with serious scholars ranging from those who view him as a largely passive constitutional monarch who deferred to his military advisors, to those who see him as an active participant in Japan's aggression, who chose the convenient moment to recast himself as a man of peace. What is not seriously disputed is that by early August 1945, Hirohito had concluded that the war needed to end, and that the path to ending it ran through his personal intervention in a governmental process that the military faction had effectively paralyzed, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the so-called Big Six, the body that theoretically governed Japan's strategic decisions, was deadlocked. 3 members, War Minister Anami, Army Chief of Staff Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Toyota, insisted on continuing the war and attaching conditions to any surrender that they knew the Americans would use. 3 members, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yonai, wanted to accept the Potsdam Declaration and end the war, with the sole condition that the emperor's position be preserved. The deadlock had persisted for days while the bombs fell and the Soviet offensive rolled forward. On the night of August 9 and into the early hours of August 10, Prime Minister Suzuki took the extraordinary step of convening an imperial conference and asking the emperor himself to break the deadlock by expressing his personal wishes. This was constitutionally irregular in ways that would have been unthinkable before the crisis point Japan had reached. The emperor spoke, he said, with the careful indirection that characterized imperial communication, that he had been giving serious thought to the current situation, and that he wished the government to accept the Allied terms. He spoke of his sorrow at the suffering of his people. He spoke of his concern for those who had served Japan faithfully in the military. He did not speak of his own survival or the preservation of his personal power in terms that a Western politician would recognize, but the meaning of his words was unmistakable. Japan should surrender. The council members who had been blocking surrender wept. Some literally collapsed. War Minister Anami, who would take his own life 4 days later in the traditional manner of a man who has failed in his duty, sat in silence. The emperor's intervention did not immediately resolve all of the institutional resistance within the military. There would be an attempted coup by young army officers who refused to accept surrender and tried to seize control of the imperial palace to prevent the broadcast of Hirohito's recorded surrender announcement. The coup failed, disorganized and poorly supported, collapsing within hours on August 15, the day the announcement was broadcast. But the decision itself, reached in that conference room in the early hours of August 10, was final. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Representatives of 9 Allied nations signed the documents. Japan's Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the Japanese government, and General Yoshijiro Umezu signed for the imperial military. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. The war in the Pacific, which had begun with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was over after 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days. The debate about what actually ended the Pacific War has never fully subsided, and it is unlikely to the traditional American narrative, which dominated popular understanding for decades after the war, holds that the atomic bombs ended the conflict by shocking Japan's leadership into a recognition that resistance was futile. This narrative has the virtues of simplicity and of giving credit for the war's end to a weapon that was in fact an unprecedented achievement and a genuine turning point. It also has the convenience of sidestepping the Soviet contribution entirely, which suited the political climate of the Cold War that followed almost immediately. The revisionist counter-narrative, developed by historians beginning in the Suez and Tuansiz and accelerating through subsequent decades, emphasizes the Soviet entry into the war as the decisive factor, arguing that Japan's military leadership was actually more immediately shattered by the loss of Manchuria and the collapse of the diplomatic strategy that depended on Soviet neutrality than by the atomic bomb. This argument has considerable evidential support in Japanese records and memoirs that became available after the war. The truth, as is usually the case when military history collides with political mythology, is more layered than either clean narrative allows. What the historical record actually shows is a Japanese decision-making process in which multiple catastrophic shocks arrived simultaneously and interacted with each other in ways that made the individual contribution of any single factor very difficult to isolate. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6 created a crisis that the military faction managed to contain, at least temporarily, by arguing about the bomb's nature and replaceability. The Soviet declaration of war and the launch of August Storm on August 9 destroyed the diplomatic strategy and the Manchurian Reserve simultaneously, in ways the military faction could not contain or argue away. The atomic bombing of Nagasaki, occurring on the same day, confirmed that the Americans had a supply of these weapons and were deploying them on a schedule that would not wait for Japanese deliberations. The combination of all three events, arriving within 72 hours of each other, created a situation that even the most committed members of Japan's war faction could not construct a rational response to. The wall they had built around themselves, the ideology of death before surrender, finally cracked not because any single blow was sufficient to break it, but because 3 overwhelming blows arrived faster than the ideology could adapt. The Soviet role in this process has been systematically underweighted in Western historical memory, for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The Cold War began almost before the ink was dry on the Missouri's surrender documents. The Soviet Union transformed within months from a wartime ally into the primary adversary of the United States. And giving the Soviets substantial credit for ending the Pacific War was politically inconvenient in the extreme. It complicated the emerging American narrative about atomic weapons and their place in national security strategy. It gave the Soviets a legitimate claim to a role in the occupation and reconstruction of Japan that the Americans had no interest in sharing. And so the Soviet contribution was quietly minimized, relegated to footnote status in popular histories, while the atomic bombs took center stage as the singular explanation for Japan's surrender. This is understandable as politics. As history, it is a distortion. The men who actually made Japan's surrender decision left records that are remarkably consistent on this point. The diary of Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, who was one of the emperor's closest advisors and a key figure in the surrender process, repeatedly identifies the Soviet entry into the war as the shock that broke the military faction's resistance in ways that the atomic bombs alone had not. Hisetsune Sakomizu, the chief cabinet secretary in August 1945, wrote after the war that the Soviet attack was like a big wave washing away the military's argument for continuing. Foreign Minister Togo, writing in his memoirs, described the Soviet offensive as having eliminated the last remaining diplomatic option and thereby forced the issue that the military had been successfully deferring. These are not the testimonies of men with any reason to minimize the atomic bomb's importance. They are the testimonies of men who were in the room when the decisions were made, describing what they actually experienced. The soldiers who fought in August Storm left their own record, though it is less accessible to Western readers because it exists primarily in Russian archives and in the memoirs of Soviet veterans, who were not, during the Cold War decades, being interviewed by American oral historians. What emerges from those accounts is a portrait of an operation conducted with a professional competence that reflected everything the Red Army had learned at catastrophic cost over 4 years of fighting the Wehrmacht. The deep battle doctrine, the encirclement strategy, the use of speed and mass to prevent the enemy from establishing a coherent defense. The logistical preparation that allowed the offensive to sustain its momentum across distances that would have paralyzed a less experienced force. All of it was executed against the Kwantung Army with a precision that the German military, which had experienced this same doctrine at its worst, would have recognized and grimly respected. The Japanese soldiers who faced the Soviet offensive in Manchuria found themselves in a situation that had no tactical answer. They fought, many of them, with the courage that had characterized Japanese infantry throughout the Pacific War. It did not matter. The force arrayed against them was too large, too fast, too well supplied, and too professionally led to be stopped by courage alone. The prisoners taken by the Soviets in Manchuria numbered in the hundreds of thousands by the time the fighting effectively ended in late August. Their fate was grim in ways that deserve acknowledgement even in a narrative focused on the war's final days. Approximately 600,000 Japanese prisoners of war were transported to Siberia and the Soviet Far East, where they were used as forced labor in conditions that killed tens of thousands of them over the following years. The last Japanese prisoners were not repatriated until 1956, 11 years after the war ended. Japan's surrender and the American occupation that followed transformed the country in ways that no one in Tokyo in August of 1945 could fully have predicted. The imperial military establishment that had dominated Japanese politics for decades was dissolved. The war crimes trials held in Tokyo between 1946 and 1948 sentenced 7 men to death and sent 16 others to life imprisonment. The constitution that MacArthur's occupation government essentially wrote for Japan renounced war as an instrument of national policy, a provision that remains in the Japanese constitution to this day. The emperor remained on his throne, which was the one condition Japan had attached to its surrender. But his role was transformed into something purely ceremonial. Stripped of the divine authority that had made him, in the ideology of the militarist state, the theoretical justification for every sacrifice the war had demanded. Hirohito lived until 1989, reigning over a Japan that had transformed itself from a militarist empire into one of the world's most successful democratic economies. He never fully reckoned publicly with his own role in the decisions that had led his country to catastrophe, speaking about the war's origins and conduct in terms so elliptical that historians have debated ever since what he actually meant and believed. Whether this ambiguity reflected genuine uncertainty, political calculation, or simply the communication style of a man formed by a court culture that had never valued directness, is a question that cannot now be answered with certainty. What can be said is that the Japan he presided over after 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the Japan that had sent its young men to die on the beaches of the Pacific and in the jungles of Southeast Asia and in the rubble of Manchuria. The transformation was real, and it was largely irreversible, and it was built on the wreckage of a military ideology that had consumed millions of lives before August Storm and 2 atomic bombs finally broke it open. The question of what actually ended the Pacific War is not merely an academic debate. It carries implications for how we understand the nature of military decision-making under extreme pressure, for how we think about the relationship between industrial power and strategic outcome, for how we assess the role of ideology in prolonging conflicts that rational calculation would have ended far sooner. Japan in 1945 was a country whose military leadership had constructed an ideological framework so rigid, so resistant to external reality, that it required not 1 but 3 simultaneous catastrophic shocks to finally crack it. 2 atomic bombs and the largest Soviet offensive in history, all arriving within 72 hours. Even then, there was an attempted coup by officers who refused to accept that the framework had failed. The ideology was that strong, and the price of that strength paid in Japanese and American and Chinese and Korean and Soviet lives, in the lives of people across a dozen countries who died in a war that Japan's military leadership extended long past the point where any rational assessment of the strategic situation would have ended it, was incalculable. August Storm lasted 11 days in its active phase, from August 9 to August 20, when organized Japanese resistance in Manchuria effectively ceased. In those 11 days, the Soviet forces advanced in some sectors over 1,000 miles, destroyed or captured the bulk of the Kwantung Army's combat power, occupied Manchuria, northern Korea, southern Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, and permanently altered the geopolitical map of Northeast Asia in ways that shaped the Cold War confrontation, and that continue to shape the relationship between Russia and Japan to the present day. The disputed Kuril Islands, seized by the Soviets in August 1945, and never returned, remain a source of unresolved tension between Russia and Japan more than 7 decades later. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel, established in the immediate aftermath of August Storm as a line separating Soviet and American occupation zones, led directly to the Korean War 5 years later, and to the division of the Korean Peninsula that persists into the 21st century. The history of August Storm is not simply a missing chapter in the story of the Second World War's end. It is a corrective to a narrative that has allowed political convenience to override historical accuracy for nearly 8 decades. The Soviet entry into the Pacific War was not a peripheral event. It was not a sideshow to the main event of American atomic diplomacy. It was a decisive operational and strategic shock that destroyed Japan's last remaining rational basis for continued resistance. That eliminated the diplomatic fallback that Japan's military leadership had been secretly relying on, and that confronted Tokyo with a two-front catastrophe that no defensive plan had been designed to survive. The bombs ended the war. The Soviet offensive made ending the war inevitable. These two things are not in contradiction. They are, together, the actual history of how the most destructive conflict in human history finally came to its end. In the summer of 1945, in the ashes of Nagasaki, and in the vast grasslands of Manchuria, where 1.5 million Soviet soldiers drove through what Japan had thought was its last line of hope, and proved beyond any argument the military faction could sustain, that the war was truly, irreversibly over.